let me welcome all of you to this 13th lecture of CUT's 40th anniversary celebrations. We continue to do that till the end of the year. The first one was launched in April last year by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the WTO. And one of the best compliments we ever received from anyone was the fact is that we've been here for 40 years, which itself is an evidence of our capabilities, that we are still alive and still kicking. We continue to work hard. When we started in 1983, it was out of a garage, and we never thought that we would ever reach Geneva or Washington, where we are now situated as well. Now, we got into international trade in the year 1991 when the Uruguay round was at its peak. And as a consequence of that, or say as a result of that, we've been working on a very large number of international economic issues, particularly competition, investment, and trade. And it's in the course of that work that we met Martin, and he was very happy to have met us and seen that we hold a very positive attitude towards free trade, but with safety nets. That has been our argument or motto, that liberalization, yes, but with safety nets. And one of the reasons why we also had the privilege of working with Montek in his long career as member of the Planning Commission and subsequently as the deputy chairman or vice chairman. Deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. There's a new name now. Suman Berry, another very dear friend and old, has been a co-conspirator in many of our work, many of our projects, including one of our admirers, and I'm so happy that you were moderating and chairing this particular session. Sanjeev Sanyal, I would like to also welcome wholeheartedly. And we are waiting for Neelkant Mishra, who is held up somewhere and should be here anytime now. Since Montek has to leave for some reasons, I would request Suman to please take over from here. And
Pradeep, firstly, it's wonderful to be amongst old friends and perhaps newer friends when Neelkant joins, but equally to be in an audience that has so many friends. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for giving me the honor of moderating a discussion with people who I've learned from, and in some ways consider myself, at least in Montek's case, consider a mentor here today. Now, just since I'm already in the role of moderator, let me just sketch what the order of business will be. I have been assigned 7 minutes, and one of the biggest perils of having a moderator speak is that there's nobody to cut him off. So cut me off at 8:12, precisely so I don't get blamed for Montek not being able to leave on time, because the main event is the lecture by Martin, and the topic is what would it take for India to become a developed country by 2047? And I just like to make a few prefatory comments to frame this, if you like, from within the perspective of Niti Aayog, and also drawing upon my own background as DG NCAR and as a development economist. So I think the first point to start, or a point where we could start, is that Lan Pritchett, who was in town, had a famous paper with Larry Summers, where he talked about regression to the mean, which is that lots of developing countries have a growth spurt, but then it peters out. And I do think before we look to the future, we should remind ourselves that India, according to the numbers that are generally accepted, has enjoyed 6% growth over 3 decades, up or down. Now, there are 2 points I want to make on that, which is that when we're talking about the future till 2047 or the past going back to 1991, um, we are talking about what economists call potential growth or supply side growth. And that's much of what the discussion, I think, is going to be. And I'm saying that because you would all know, as readers of the newspapers, that we are already at 7% growth, we had 8% growth. I just want to say that the long run is quite different from the short run because the short run is influenced by demand side fluctuations, the global economy. What we're looking at is what it takes to maintain this over a long run. And I would make 2 points in that regard. One is that the Europeans, particularly the French, have this phrase "le trente glorieuses," the glorious 30 years, which led to the reconstruction of Europe after the war, the Marshall Plan, etc. So, you could argue that India has already had its trente glorieuses, and now the challenge is to keep that show going in a different world for another 30 years. And what we know is that that is hard, possibly unprecedented. Not unprecedented, I mean, China is, but it's rare. And so the discussion is really how, in a different economy and a different world, to at least equal the 6% that we've enjoyed up till now. And I'm not talking about per capita because population trends have been changing, but and then what it takes to get beyond 6%. Now, the next point is, does it matter how you measure what it means to be a developed economy by 2047? And there are various alternatives. Many of you would have seen the figure of $30 billion by 2047. That's a number that has gone out. It's complicated because dollars don't stay the same. But I think there's a general consensus, not only at NITI, but also in this excellent issue of The Economist, sorry, Martin, and also Goldman Sachs, that what we're talking about is a percent or a percentage point and a half point increase above the 6% that we've seemed to have had the institutions to deliver, to something like 7.5. Martin will give you his point of view on that, and maybe in the Q&A, I will query or provide an additional gloss on that. I would just make 3 final points. First, some of you may have heard this phrase about a middle income trap. I do want you to know that where India at the moment, in the classification by the World Bank, is we are still a lower middle income country. It'll take us a while to become an upper middle income country. Hopefully we will achieve that by 2030. And after that is the heavy lifting as an upper middle income country to reach developed or advanced country status. I'm saying this because an operative time horizon, and certainly for this government, just recently, this parliament, I should say, is the period to 2030, maybe the period to 2035, and then it all starts to become a bit more speculative. And the fact that I, was at Shell and worked on scenarios means that the degree of uncertainty rises. And then you've got to think about, issues like resilience, technological change, etc. So I just wanted to say that it's not continuous from 2024 to 2047. We need to be thinking of it in stages. My final 2 points would be that why has Prime Minister called this Amrit Kal? He's called it Amrit Kal because, as happened in East Asia, in the 70s and 80s, uh, this is the era of our demographic dividend. It's complicated by the scale, 610, by the scale of, and the diversity of India. But just to say that if there was a golden moment, or golden couple of decades it's now, and my final point would be scale. The paradox is that India does so many things at scale. If you talk about the elections, or if you talk about rationing, but the one thing we don't seem to be able to do is scale up our manufacturing. And I think as we in NITI, and I do think that it's very important that Prime Minister has put Viksit Bharat out there to stimulate a debate, because frankly, he thinks much more of what comes to him from everybody. He thinks of it as a Jan Andolan rather than coming from NITI. And so the question of what it would take to, as it were, make us succeed in the game of scale, I think, is a core issue that I hope our discussants will help us all address. With that, Martin.
One little house announcement. I know it may be redundant, but if you could please keep your mobiles on silent, it'll be good. Secondly, I wanted to also share with you, which I forgot, that Martin had also delivered the 30th anniversary lecture of Cuts in London. So it's a very old association. Thank you.
So first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in India. This is my last evening on this trip. And I've given lectures in this place before, one of them at least 20 years ago. But I'm sure this is going to be very stimulating. It is also, as I think Suman mentioned, a reunion of old friends. And I think in this case, it's old in both senses. Some of us are pretty close to 80. And but in addition, I should point out that I have known Montek since very, very well since 1971, when I joined the domestic finance division of the World Bank, along with somebody called Shankaracharya. And as I've many times said, Montek was my first boss. And therefore, he's, of course, always right, except when he disagrees with me, which, of course, doesn't happen very often. And Suman joined the World Bank a year later, and I've known him pretty well since then, though I don't think we were ever in the same division. And I've known Pradeep for, you said 30 years, or is it for 30? More. Yeah, of course. I have been involved with Cuts many times, and I've given so many lectures for it that I can't even begin to remember. So I'm going to talk about this subject. I have 30 minutes, which is now reduced to 27. And so let me stress a very simple point. I am not going to discuss almost everything that is relevant to this question, because that would require a lecture of 5 or 6 hours. I'm predominantly focusing on the area of my comparative advantage, which is what's happening in the world and how that might constrain or affect what India can do. And the single most important point here is that if anything like this happens, then India will become, in the world context, a very, very big economy and country. And that will create challenges and opportunities that have only previously been experienced by one other developing country, which is, of course, China. And the impact of that on India and for India is something people should be starting to think about now, even though it's not, for reasons that I've explained, yet a burning issue. I will also talk briefly about some aspects of those opportunities and I think mistakes that India must avoid. So this is not working. So we've got it. Come on. Oh, dear. So just to remind you, this is a quote which you will all know from the Prime Minister of India at the Red Fort in August 2023, which I think was Independence Day. In fact, I'm sure it was. And he said, "I have an unwavering belief that in 2047, when the country celebrates 100 years of independence, my country will be a developed India." I love that, So let me move on to explain the outline of my remarks. I'm going to start with the aspiration, how I define it, which is very idiosyncratically, but it doesn't really change very much the broad story. Then I'm going to talk about the big background issue, which is the global economic slowdown, which I think is structural and permanent. And the significance of that, just to get there, is that if India does anything like this, it will mean that India's economy will be growing over 25 years or so, at least twice as fast as the world economy. That has quite important implications for the relationship between India. In fact, it has to be faster than that and the rest of the world. I'm going to talk about the global economic prospects. I'm going to talk about deglobalization or globalization, particularly the issue of what happens in the trading system. Then I'm going to talk about the prospects, and then I'll talk about India's options with a few conclusions. So, is Mr. Modi's goal of making India a high-income country by 2047 plausible or even feasible? Well, I don't think it's plausible. It is feasible. But to do it, India will have to perform pretty close, not the same, to what China did in the 20-odd years up to 2012. But even if it doesn't, if it merely continues on its present track, India is still likely to become, on most definitions, a superpower by the middle of the century. Size matters. The fact of India's population changes everything if it sustains its recent growth rate. So I thought what an amusing way of approaching this issue was to take a country which will define what I mean as a benchmark for becoming a developed country. Now, it turns out that if you look, and I'm sure you've never seen the comparison between India and Greece. So that is, Greece, it turns out to be the IMF's poorest advanced country. At present, India's GDP per head, measured at purchasing power parity, which I think is the least bad way of comparing standards of living across countries. I'm prepared to defend that, but I won't say anything more about that. Following the IMF, I use that data. I think it's better than the World Bank's. Anyway, India's GDP per head is a quarter of that of Greece. If India's GDP per head grew at its 1990 to 2029 trend rate, I'm using IMF forecasts to get a longer average, and Greece's GDP per head did the same, and its previous performance was dreadful, so this is very favorable to India. It's quite possible that Greece will cease to be an advanced country if it continues on its recent path. Then India's GDP per head at PPP would be about 60% of that of Greece in 2047, which means it will be an upper middle income country, but not an advanced country. To catch up, India's trend rate, by these are all per GDP per head, rate of growth of GDP per head would need to reach 7.5% a year, which is almost 3 percentage points higher than the 4.8, and that would match roughly China's rate of growth in its boom years. And it would be a hell of an achievement for a country this size to manage that. Is it likely greater than 50% probability? I think very clearly no. It's not impossible, but it would involve a lot of policy improvement and a pretty favorable environment. And I leave it to you to some extent to just consider what that policy improvement might be. But there is another way of looking at it. If India's economy were to grow at, say, 6.5% a year until 2047, which is at least 2 percentage points lower than required to become an advanced country on my criteria, against what I expect to be around 4% in China. This is just a guess. 3% in the world economy, which I will explain, and 2.3% in the US, which happens to be its 1990 to 2029 trend, India would become the second largest economy in the world at purchasing power parity by 2047, slightly ahead of the US. Now, at market prices, it would certainly be smaller than the US, but China is smaller than the US at market prices now, and nobody really denies it's a superpower if you look at the range of things it can do. So if something like this were to be achieved up to the middle of this century, then India would become a world power of very, very significant dimensions. And there are big implications of that, many of which will go far beyond this lecture. Now, with that basic introduction to the significance of this issue and some of the options, let me stress, I'm not standing in ferocious defense of any particular forecast. I'm just trying to give you some scenarios. Let me talk a bit about the global context. So I'll talk about the global growth in living standards. I will note the big slowdown. I'll talk about the causes of it and reasons for optimism and pessimism about the global future. So let me just focus on these charts. So what I've got here, I've got three, I think, in this. These are all growth of GDP per head in the world and in developing and advanced countries. And what I've done here is take 10-year moving averages. So these are trends. This is follow very much what Suman said, long-term trends, not fluctuations. And I've placed them at the end year. So if you look at any particular point, this shows, if you and this these charts, this shows the average of the previous 10 years growth rates, and you will see, I think, two essential things, or maybe three essential things. First, these trends have been on a marked decline since about between 2008 and 2012. Massive, consistent decline, and we're seeing no sign of reversal. The declines are very large. In the case of Asian emerging and developing country, the decline from the peak to now is roughly 3 percentage points a year. That's a big decline. There's a smaller decline for emerging and developing countries, but please note that the decline of the developed countries, though only a percentage point, is almost a halving of the underlying trend growth of per capita GDP, and it's now basically 1% a year. So it's general decline, particularly big decline for the emerging and developing countries, but a miserable performance for the high income, the advanced countries. The second thing I wanted to focus on is another way of seeing that, on the gap between growth of GDP per head in developing and advanced countries. And I'm focusing here to treat the developed countries as the benchmark, and this is the difference between them and these groups. And you can see that in both cases, the rate of catch-up on the GDP per head of the advanced countries has slowed by a very considerable measure. For the emerging countries of Asia, it's basically halved, and for the emerging countries as a whole, it's not quite halved, but it has fallen by roughly 2 percentage points, and the catch-up rate for the emerging and developing countries is only now 1% a year. And this is consistent with the big point that Arvind Subramanian has recently made, that what we are seeing is a marked general slowdown in convergence, along with a slowdown in global economic growth I'm showing. And though I don't have time to discuss that, I think these are correlated. So the general story of dynamism slowdown has gone along with a marked reduction in the rate at which emerging and developing countries in aggregate, and these are weighted by size, so big countries count for more than others, have been catching up on the developed country. This is a pretty depressing backdrop for the understanding the context. Now, the final chart I want to show in this set is about where India fits into this sort of picture. And to do that, I have done something which I've done quite previously before, which is essentially the same mechanism as I've showed before over the same period, the same averages, but I've taken the 7 largest emerging economies by GDP per head, by GDP at PPP. So I focused on the large economies and seen what has happened to them. And here you can see that the single most striking feature, which is the red line, is the dramatic decline in trend growth of China since about 2012. And between 2012 and the forecast for 2029, which I think are very plausible, the trend growth rate has gone from 10 to 4. And that is a startling slowdown. I don't have time to discuss why this happened. The second point that I'm going to make is the light blue line is India. And given there have been some big shocks in here, above all the pandemic, India's growth of GDP per head has been between, over 10-year periods, has been between 4 and 6, and has remained within that band very comfortably for what will, if these figures are right, be a good 30 years. Remember, these charts really start in 1990. Actually, it's 40 years, I apologize. So, and it's chugging along between 4 and 6%, remember, GDP per head, PPP. The only other countries to have had a comparably good performance of these large emerging countries, and not as good as India, are Indonesia and Turkey. Russia has collapsed. Brazil and Mexico are a disaster. So India has a notably good performance, and at the moment, the forecast is it will be the fastest growing of these countries over the 2020s. So now I want to talk, that's the picture of what's been happening and the future. And I think the most important conclusion I would reach this is the world economy's growth has slowed quite fundamentally. And if I turn from GDP per head to GDP, I think it's a reasonable guess that the world is going to grow at about 3% a year at PPP. These are not certain, but it will be my best guess. Now, why the slowdown? What has caused the slowdown we see? Well, there are a number of points I would make. First, the very strong performance before 2007 was in significant measure a bubble economy associated with a one-off colossal financial sector boom, not a trend, and therefore the end of this was structural. The second reason for the slowdown, I don't know why I missed a zero, is the impact of multiple shocks. The global financial crisis, which was really a transatlantic financial crisis between 2007 and 2015 when it ended in Europe, and of course the recent pandemic, inflation and war. But we don't see any real sign that those shocks fundamentally change the picture I show. I think, I don't have time to, there's been consistent over-optimism about the long-term impact of new technologies on underlying trend productivity growth. And I believe that continues. There's, in my view, hugely exaggerated hopes of what AI will do to productivity, but we will see. 4, very important, rising uncertainty about all the shocks we've had, and I've listed a whole lot of them, which have discouraged investment in many, many countries, both emerging and developed. Worsening policy, a point that the IMF has made very well in its most recent World Economic Outlook. Deteriorating policies, fiscal, microeconomic, trade, and so forth. China's deceleration, which I've already pointed out, which is dramatic. And finally, the move from rapid globalization and opening of economies to its opposite, or at least to something close to it. Now, let me refer to that very quickly in this next session, which is what's going to happen to the world trading system and the openness of the world economy. And remember that in my view, that's as important to India, possibly even more important than how fast the world economy grows, because it affects how easy it is to expand trade in the context of any given growth rate. Of course, these deglobalization, or what's sometimes called slowbalization, is going to affect the growth rate of the world economy. I've said it's one of the reasons for slowdown, but it also affects the rate at which trade can expand for any fast-growing country. And here I think I will make a point I don't think I've made before. If we assume, as I've suggested, that to get anything close to the target that I'm discussing, then that the growth of GDP in India has to be at least 6.5%. And if you really want to get to the target considerably faster, that means India will be growing at least twice as fast as world GDP. And I'm going to come later to what that means for its trade. So the second question is, so the questions that I'm asking, are we deglobalizing or slowbalizing? Are we actually reversing globalization or merely keeping it constant? Are we friendshoring or regionalizing? What is the pattern of the breakup, the reduction in trade relative to GDP? And the answers seem to be that we are slowbalizing. We are not deglobalizing, but the slowbalization, that is to say, the slowdown in the rate of growth of trade relative to world GDP, is very striking. And it is also clear from some quite good analysis, I'll show you, that we are friendshoring, not regionalizing. But policy is on a knife edge. Trade could implode if political relations collapsed. So this is the optimistic perspective. So let me show you a few charts that illustrate this. This is a chart which shows the ratio of world exports over world output, and they're essentially world export of goods. These are the only thing we have data. And go back to 1800. There are lots of points about this, but I won't make. But the key point, we had a huge upswing in world growth trade over GDP in the second half of the 19th century. This ended with the First World War and led to a total collapse after the Great Depression, the Second World War. After that, we had a massive upswing in world trade relative to GDP, creating the most open world economy in the history of the world, as far as we know. And since 2012, this has been fluctuating, but more or less stable. So roughly speaking, we moved from a period when trade grew twice as fast as world GDP to a period when it's grown roughly as fast as world GDP, and that's the slowbalizing period. Now, interestingly, my friend Richard Baldwin, in a whole series of papers and books, I won't go into it, has pointed out that services have by and large been doing better. Not dramatically better. You can clearly see that the trend of service growth relative to world GDP has slowed. It's shown in both of these two charts, but it is now not much faster. Now it's still faster than world GDP. So services look better, But remember, services are much smaller relative to world GDP than manufacturers, even now. And the final chart I want to show in this section is this question of friendshoring. This is a very nice little analysis by the WTO, which shows world trade in dollars, its nominal dollars, as an index, and it divides world trade between trade within blocks, political, economic friends. I won't discuss how they achieve this, and cross blocks. And what you can see is over the last 2-3 years, there's been a marked decline in trade between blocks against trade within blocks. In other words, friendshoring is indeed beginning to be seen in the numbers. Now, what does all this mean for the future? Well, there are reasons for optimism. The most obvious is the shocks have come to an end, that we hope, an acceleration of technological change, reversal of benign policy trends of the past 1.5 decades, but there are very many reasons for pessimism. Climate change, which I haven't mentioned, which is going to become, I think, significant. Demographics, quite general, not in India, but quite general. Aging and sub-replacement fertility rates in high-income and upper middle-income countries, which is going to slow growth in multiple ways. Serious fragilities, high indebtedness, intense great power competition, global economic fragmentation, diminishing cooperation and threats of war, decay of liberal democracy, rise of populism, real constitutional uncertainty. And I think on balance, all this means that the pessimistic view of the future is plausible. And I think my 3% is a pretty reasonable guess and probably will turn out to be rather optimistic. Now, what does this finally mean in the last 3 or 4 minutes? What does this all mean for India? The global environment has changed fundamentally. It is more dangerous and chaotic than at the least prior to 2007, and it creates huge risks. But India also has big opportunities. It can form useful and productive economic relations with all sides. It can, if it really tries, partially replace China, which is a deep desire of the West as a competitive global supplier of goods and services. It can become a magnet for FDI, and it can have serious influence on global discussions because it's going to be a superpower. India can still take advantage then of global openness. It has substantial assets in seeking to shape the world. It is an obvious +1 in a world of China +1. It has pretty good relations with the West and especially with the US, to which it is strategically important. It has an immensely successful Indian diaspora, which can be create hugely successful links with the Western economies, and its size, it gives it the resources to diversify and upgrade the economy over time. So, given all this, what should India do? I think it is likely to be tempted by quite aggressive and possibly inward-looking industrial policies, and possibly even self-sufficiency, and I would continue to argue that this would be a big mistake. I will just list here 3 big mistakes being made in the current debate by Chatterjee and Subramaniam. I have a lovely paper on this. They argue that there is a widespread belief that India is already a large country with a large market, so the world market doesn't matter. This isn't true. It's not yet a huge economy. It's a little bit around the size of Germany, which is not a very large economy in market prices. But more important, they argue that the actual true market for tradable goods and services, especially more sophisticated one, is quite a bit less than GDP because there are a lot of poor people. The second is there are a lot of people who argue that exports have not been important for Indian growth. I leave that to Montic to argue against. But the basic point, I think it's absolutely clear to me that the trade liberalization and everybody else in the early 90s was a decisive shift in India's growth trajectory. And the belief that global opportunities are disappearing, while there are reasons for concern, they haven't gone, and for the reasons that I've already said, that's going to continue at as it is now, India still has a very small share in world exports and world exports of commercial services. It shouldn't abandon the field. It's incredibly important that it does so. So my conclusion from that is that India needs to maintain its ratio of trade to GDP, which has been roughly stable now for quite a long time, at this level. It shouldn't allow it to collapse, and that means trade must grow at least as fast as India's GDP. And to do that in this difficult world, India has to pay a lot of attention to preserving the competitiveness of a whole range of India's goods and services. The obstacles to the necessary progress, I think, lie overwhelmingly, at least in the next 10 years or so, barring catastrophe worldwide, in domestic policies and institutions and politics. Inclusive and rapid growth on the desired scale, and we've discussed that already, will require, I believe, sustained openness, but of course also huge investments in physical and human capital. But openness remains a handmaiden of economic progress. It'll just be more difficult to extract advantages. Today, the opportunity increasingly lies in services where India has a strong comparative advantage. So my conclusion, India wishes to become a high-income country by 2047. That is unlikely to be achieved, in my view, but it certainly should become an upper middle income country. And if it continues to do well, it could become an advanced country. But the challenges are indeed enormous. Even if it is just an upper middle income country, it will be a superpower. The slow growing, shock prone and fragile world we now confront is going to make this rise difficult. That means that India will have to work even harder to use its influence to shape that world in a favorable direction, and to shape itself to exploit the opportunities it will still have, but which are likely to be more difficult, in some respects at least, than they have been in much of the last 30 years. Thank you for listening.
Bravo, Martin, and 30 minutes to the second. But while we could have some conversation, but let me immediately ask Montague. And you've been assigned 10 minutes. You may not wish to take all that, but yeah. No, because you are having.
Yeah, Montague for half an hour also.
Thanks very much, Suman, and thank you, Pradeep, for inviting me. As Martin said, we go back a very long way, and I really did want to hear him. I have to explain that I'm supposed to catch a flight in a very short time, so I'm only going to take 5 minutes, but it was treated as my tribute to Martin that in spite of the flight, I did want to hear him, and I'll take just 5 minutes to comment. He's covered an enormous amount of ground, and I agree with almost everything he says. I want to just point out something which might be relevant for the discussion. Because, certain areas that he's covered, and people can have different views. Are we going to grow at 6%, 6.5%, 7%, whatever? But I think there's one issue that he raises, which is quite central to the policy debate in India today. And, from what little I know, I think there are people within the establishment who are on both sides. So it's not as if this is something which nobody inside the government believes either. But then there are others who take a different view. And let me say that's true not just in the government, but outside also. So on the political spectrum, the critical issue that he has raised is an issue that we've always faced before, but it's never been as important. And that is the question of what should be our trade policy. Now, in the days when the world was booming, and we did quite well in that period, it could be argued that, we'd have done well anyway. The world is not booming. It's actually going through a lot of uncertainties. And policies also in the rest of the world are apparently going in the wrong direction, so the IMF at least says. So his view is, and I agree with him, that for whatever reason, India is in a sweet spot. And India is in a sweet spot because China isn't in a sweet spot for whatever reason, the rest of the world decided that they want a China plus one situation. Now, we don't have to go into whether they're right or not. That is leading to policies that will restrict trade generally, and that would obviously be negative for everybody, including India. But because it's a China plus one bias, and because of what he says, that India can cash in on that in a way that many other countries can't. I mean, some are, but many others can't. The real question is, are we going to actually decide to be more open than we have been in a world in which everyone else is becoming less open? That's the central issue. And I happen to agree with him that that's what we should do. I would say that I know of people within the establishment who probably have a similar view, but there are also many who don't. And even outside, there is this debate. So really, in the questioning that happens, we would be doing Martin the best favor we can think of, enabling him to say later on that in this wonderful audience on this issue, how did people come out? Do most people agree with this point of view or do they not? I've already declared my position. He's right. And I would say one other thing, and the government has quite categorically said, and this is right that they've said it, that we want to get into global supply chains. I mean, it's not a policy that says, look, we don't want to have anything to do with trade. But the real problem is that if you want to get into global supply chains, what should your trade policy be? Now, I would say it means, since we have very, very high customs duties, we should be clearly lowering them. That's a controversial position. Not everybody will agree with that. And we'll know, for example, by the time the budget is presented, what steps are being taken in that direction. I mean, we're doing a whole bunch of FTAs, which is a good idea. Because frankly, we have in the past been dismissive of FTAs for the best reason. That is, we are in favor of multilateral trade liberalization. Multilateral trade liberalization doesn't seem to have much of a future. I mean, the guys who do trading have made it quite plain that it's going to be some kind of plurilateral agreement or not. Now, I think we will have to change our policy because traditionally we have disapproved of participating in any plurilateral activity on the grounds that it goes contrary to the multilateral commitments that we have. Now, if we are going to have FTAs, which we say we are, I think two issues will come up. Number one, FTAs are no longer just about tariffs. They are really about agreeing to behind the border alignment of standards. And the question should be asked, should we do that? Amongst our trade negotiators, there is a very strong view that we shouldn't, that this is actually an unnecessary violation of sovereignty. I think that's wrong. I mean, that's not the way the world is going. And if India is going to become a major power and become Viksit Bharat by 2047, even if we don't become completely Viksit Bharat, we become high upper middle income country, we just have to recognize that a lot of this realignment of standards is necessary. Most of all, if you're going to have an FTA with a country, with most countries that we are looking for FTAs, their external tariffs are much lower than ours. It doesn't make sense to have an FTA unless you can also lower your own tariffs. And frankly, I think we need to persuade Indian industry that they have a greater capability of competing than they themselves think. And secondly, quite frankly, what's the exchange rate for? I mean, all these people who go around saying, raise the duty by 2%, 3%, 4%. Fact of the matter is that the rupee has been appreciating in real terms, and it shouldn't have. So if you take a composite view of all these things, what I hope is in the question, you don't have to agree with me, but what I hope is when you pose questions to Martin, and when I call him in London tomorrow from Pune, and I'll ask him, did people agree with your view or not? I hope he'll be able to give a clear answer. So thank you for inviting me, Pradeep. And Martin, I'm sorry I'm rushing off, but I've heard you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep, for inviting me, and thank you, everyone, coming here to listen to us. So it is a privilege listening to Martin. I would like to weigh in on the questions that Montek also raised on openness. I'll throw out a simple statistic. So if suppose from being a $4 trillion economy, we were to become a $20 trillion economy, and think about the $16 trillion of additional GDP that we need to add, how much of that will be from net trade, either import substitution or a greater share of export value add. And whatever the math we do, when I look at other nations around us, I don't think that number will be more than $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. So still needs to be a lot more change and reform, and that's something that India needs to sort out. While I will share my views on the external orientation, I think the most significant challenges are on the internal front. So there will be, I think, at least 13 to 14, if not $15 trillion of that additional 16 that need to come from internal generation of GDP. I'll build on that a bit. If you compare a lower middle income country to a developed country, a Viksit country, the biggest difference is the capital stock. And of course, there is, human capital as well. But there are issues and we need to solve those. But if you think about capital stock, it comes in three forms. It's not just factory machines. It also includes infrastructure, and it also includes housing stock. And a lot of the debate that we have seen, in fact, even the analysis of the investment cycles in India completely ignores the fact that the slowdown that occurred between 2012 and 2021 was primarily a slowdown in India's real estate industry. In fact, when you look at the drop in private sector capex, which of course everyone keeps fretting about, that was also mostly in sectors which feed into real estate. So a very large part of capital formation in any economy is real estate. And I think managing the real estate cycle, which is completely absent from all policy discussions, is going to be extremely important. The second aspect of that is urban infrastructure. You cannot have a healthy real estate market, you cannot have an efficient population if you can't travel from point A to point B efficiently. We have finally started to address that. I come from Mumbai, where we are going through a complete transformation in the way the city is going to move in the next 2-3 years. But we need to do that for 1,000 cities. And we don't have the right models for governance. We don't have the right models for financing. Less than 5% of fiscal resources go directly to cities. What we need to see is more than 30-40% going. Maybe not 50% plus the way China did it. I think they've gone to the other extreme, but we do need to see some of these challenges being addressed if we need to sustain even growth in the real estate cycle. On the external front, I do think that we need to stay open. While I mentioned that only about $1 trillion of the additional 16 will come from external trade, the channels through which trade affects growth are also financialization. It includes the changes in productivity. And again, if you compare to end state of a developed country, it has to be open. So it has to have an open capital account. Well, China is trying to disprove us, but they're struggling. But you need to have an open capital account. You need to have Indian multinational outside, significant foreign flows. Now you see the number of expatriates that you see in India. You look at the billion, I think, I forget the exact number, but I think it's about $6 to $8 billion is what foreigners staying in India are now sending abroad. So we are used to remittances coming in, but now there is a significant number of foreign workers in India who are sending money abroad. So as we go develop, there'll be an increasing flow of people, and so we should be assuming significant, a more openness than more restriction. But as we think about this challenge, we need to also incorporate where China is. There's a column that's about to get published where I say China equal to China plus one. So the roots of that title Go back to my days in programming, where in a for loop you put n equal to n plus 1. But the reason I say that is throughout this discussion of China plus 1, China's global share of manufacturing has actually gone up. So they have gained in the last 3 years 2 to 2.5% of global share of manufacturing. In the last 4 years, from March 20 to March 24, medium to long-term loans to industry have gone up by $1.9 trillion. Just for the sake of perspective, India's total banking system loan book is $2 trillion. This includes mortgages, this includes agri loans, this includes services loans, this includes everything. Everything put together throughout history, we've created $2 trillion of loans. The Chinese have given $1.9 trillion to industry in the last 4 years incrementally. If this grows up, if this continues, you will see another $2.5 trillion going to industry in the next 5 years. Now, what China did to labor-intensive industries in the last 25 years, after 20 years after joining WTO, they are going to do to capital-intensive industries the world over. It's not to criticize China. That's been their business model. I mean, if you think about the misuse of capital that existed in the 80s, you read about the history of how things were made and which were completely unusable, several billion yuan of products discarded in the 80s, 30-40% of GDP worth of bank recapitalization in 2003. This is routine. It's just that China is now a $20 trillion economy, so now they can do a lot more damage. They are completely dominant in the industries of the future, and one assumes that this will fade as they are becoming more insular, but that will take a long time coming. So we need to have a strategy of how to deal with a much more aggressive China on these fronts. So there are places where we may need to use the cheap products that they provide, but there are places where we'll need to work hard to. Maybe it's a small yard, high fence approach, and then the yard never remains small. The biggest challenge, which I think we should add to the list of concerns that Martin has, is inequality. Remember that any country which has gone through this phase of growth has faced growing inequality. And most countries, when they passed through this phase of growth, were not democracies. There was no universal franchise 100 years back. I mean, Japan in 1924, but even the UK only around the First World War after it got universal franchise. So India has to handle significantly higher levels of democracy, of inequality, which are inevitable at this stage of growth, while staying a democracy. And you will see, what we have documented is that there are now 10 states of India which are transferring 1,500 rupees a month to women. This is now adding up to 1.9 trillion rupees a year, 0.6% of India's GDP. All of this has started in the last 3-4 years. So politics is starting to respond. It is happening at the state level, so this is not a general government deficit concern. But you will have to see many more. I'm not saying this is the right solution or the wrong solution, just making an observation that as we think about the sustenance of more openness, lower fiscal deficits, less interventionist governments, we also need to understand that this is a democracy, and that if inequality goes beyond a certain threshold, we are not China, it will not be sustained, and therefore there will be a regime change. So with that, I assume I've taken up my time, so thank you very much for being patient.
Thank you. So I will just say that you are a polymath, and all of this has been rather dry economics. Can we look to you to, recognize the fact that this is a generalist audience? And sorry, I was told, right? Could I? Let's see. Yeah. Could I just request? Oh, wow. Yes. Could I just request you, to bring this down to earth, if I could ask?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Martin, for a very interesting presentation. Obviously, you've taken up a very difficult task, which is looking out 25 years. And certainly, what you said is a possible outcome. I will say it's even a plausible outcome. But of course, the world looking out is always difficult to predict, especially you're taking a 25-year view. So in that context, let me say there are a few things I'm not too, let's say, enthusiastic about some of your comments. One is this idea of rising uncertainty. Now, everybody likes getting up on stage and saying the world is going to be an uncertain place. But the fact of the matter is, if I had asked you in 2020, you would have said, oh my God, we are in the middle of a pandemic. The world is an uncertain place. If you had asked you 10 years earlier, in 2010, you said, we've just come out of the financial crisis. This is an uncertain place. Go back another 10 years, we've just had the dot-com bubble burst, Asian crisis. The world is an uncertain place. Go back another 10 years before that, oh my God, the Soviet Union has collapsed. So the point I'm making is the world is an uncertain place. We should just accept that and get on with it. It's not becoming any more or less uncertain. We'll find out if it was a bad place or a good place after 25 years. The second point is worsening policy making. Well, certainly not in India, I hope. But while I agree that policy making in the West in the last decade or so has been some sort suspect, I hope at some point, and I'm assuming at some point, people will stop listening to Stiglitz and Krugman. I mean, people do respond to situations as they emerge. And while, politics in the West right now looks all jammed up, it's a bit too pessimistic, I think, to think that, societies will not respond to those situations. So the point I'm making is, yes, I mean, it is a plausible outcome that you outlined, but I don't think it's any more plausible than a much more optimistic one. It is a possible outcome. But I will say there are a few things that would happen if that path was taken, which I think do need some consideration. One of them is, do remember that India's population growth rate is radically slowing, to the effect that effectively our population is growing at less than 0.5%. In the 2030s, it will basically not be growing. So, which means that our per capita income from here on is almost identical to our GDP growth rate. In that sense, we will see our per capita income growth dramatically go up just by virtue of the fact that our population is not growing. In fact, somewhere in the end of the period we are discussing, we will in fact be slipping into negative territory of circa 2050, 55. So we do need to take that into account. So, and hence the point about our urgency of trying to make the next 25 years count. Now, in that context, something else will happen in the rest of the world. I think we will enter into an era of radically cheap capital. Because in an environment, given the demographics of the world, you will end up, and I'll give the example of China, which is now will be the world's largest economy very shortly, where its savings rate will simply be sticky because it is aging rapidly. It will not fall very fast. But its investment rate increasingly will find that there is not enough. I mean, that huge investment boom that happened for building infrastructure, housing, etc. It doesn't need shrinking population. So what you will have is its collapsing investment rate and a sticky savings rate. And some version of this will happen in other developed countries as well. China will be the most dramatic, which will mean that all of them will end up in an environment of huge surplus savings, which the rest of the world will have to absorb. And that will mean that India has an opportunity of getting massive amounts of cheap capital sloshing around the world, which we could use to grow a lot faster than anybody anticipates. So yes, perhaps a more difficult place to export to, but a source of very, very cheap capital. Now this brings us up to a particular problem that we don't give enough attention to when we are talking about the middle income trap, which is the capability of financial systems in countries in India's stage of development to be able to sensibly allocate this huge surge of capital. In fact, this is what happened to most countries that get stuck in the middle income trap. Let's take, for example, the Southeast Asian countries. They grew very, very quickly, a lot of it using cheap capital from the rest of the world, and misallocated it. And then they had the Asian crisis in 1997, 98, and never quite recovered from it. And this is, I think, of the many things that we need to think about, this is something that we don't pay adequate attention to. We will get the capital to build our bridges, build our homes, build those factories, do many other things. In fact, India's fiscal will dramatically improve if our domestic interest rates decline, which I expect they will in the medium term. But what will happen is that we will always have to watch our financial system very, very carefully, that it doesn't do something nasty. And as a person who spent 2017, 18, 19 cleaning up banks, let me tell you, I never want to go through that experience again. It's like extracting teeth. So this is, I think, the single biggest risk to us. And in fact, there's already discussions about our equity markets being a bit frothy. So this is something we need to watch out for. As far as FTAs are concerned and trade openness is concerned, I would say, today's policymakers are generally sympathetic to the idea of being open and export-oriented. We certainly want to be a part of the global supply chains. We do want to sign FTAs. We have signed one with Australia, one with UAE, and hopefully with the new government in the UK, we'll be able to sign one soon with Britain as well. So this is something we do want to pursue aggressively. But at the same time, I will say, we will, like any country, protect our interests. And in this context, let me say that we have found that blocks like, for example, Europe, have begun to use things like the environmental, social, and governance norms as non-tariff barriers, and in ways that are not entirely kosher. I mean, it doesn't really smell well when green steel is defined in a peculiar way in which all the patents are held by those same countries. So this requires a degree of give and take, and we will protect our interests. It's not because we don't want a part of the global supply chains, but I think there is a case for having a reasonable, balanced discussion about what things like ESG mean. I'm not arguing against environmental, social, and governance norms. I'm just pointing out to you that these norms have to be arrived at with discussions with countries like India, with which want to trade with. They cannot be unilaterally imposed through CBAM or whatever other mechanism. So I think the point I'm making is that we want to be open. I have certainly no interest in going back to Nehruvian import substitution and drive around in ambassador cars. So totally with the idea of keeping ourselves open, exporting, and being a part of the global supply chain. It is going to be important. And as I mentioned, a lot of our building of our economy will happen with, of course, domestically driven capital, but the extra kick is certainly going to come from foreign capital. And the ability of our economy to be able to take both this vast and growing pool of domestic capital and cheap global capital and allocate it sensibly without blowing it up over 25 years, a difficult task, but something we will have to do. With that, let me stop. I hope I've been adequately provocative.
Yeah, okay. We're absolutely on time. Thanks. I was given a slot by Pradeep as a moderator, but I do think that there ought to be an opportunity for discussion in the panel itself. I don't know how hard a stop we have at 7:30, or is the room needed elsewhere? Or no. Okay, fine. Oh, well, okay. I wasn't expecting quite that much indulgence. So I'll try and make it a little thematic. Okay. let's because I think for people to know when it's going to end rather than drift away is better. So a number of issues have come up, and we have a lot of expertise in the room. And I've given up my, what time there was allocated for discussion within the panel moderated by me to accommodate Sanjeev. Now, let me call on people if they don't mind. So the first issue, or one issue that has arisen in what Sanjeev had to say, in what Martin had to say, what has been Pradeep's life's work, is really what are the challenges for India in its economic diplomacy. Pradeep, let me ask you, and then I'll maybe go to Raja Mohan. I don't know if there are any people in the room who have been our diplomats in Geneva or whatever. But how do you see, as it were, becoming a big boy in economic diplomacy? Do we have the skills? Are we? Raja Mohan had said in terms of the way we reacted to the collapse of the Soviet Union, crossing the Rubicon, that, actually when the challenge arose, we were up to it. Do you see our capacity as having increased? I see Ambassador, forgive my, Baswati Mukherjee is here too. Maybe she'd like to come in. But let me get you to start. With
Well, let me to begin with point out that we have former ambassador to the WTO, Ujjwal Bhatia here,
oh,
and he has also been the chairman of the appellate body, which is now defunct. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we have today in front of the multilateral trading system, is to how to revive the dispute settlement system. Now, in terms of India's economic diplomacy, I think we have been very aggressive in a way and very negative, and that has been a problem. I had a very good discussion with Ambassador Mohan Kumar, who wrote a book which was released recently, and he said that India is less of a naysayer. I beg your pardon. I said, look, India continues to remain a naysayer for no rhyme or reason. I'll give you two examples. I have served on the WTO DG's advisory panel thrice, and this is the third time. And can you imagine that India moved a resolution in the General Council objecting to the DG's power to appoint such panel? I said, don't you have anything better to do? Just giving an example of a ludicrous.
what could be more important than clipping Pradeep Mehta's wings?
No, not my way. No, actually, they were hitting the DG. But what I'm only trying to say is this: did the ambassador or did our mission not have anything better to do there?
Yeah.
Secondly, what was something which is politically very unsmart a part of India was to object to the adoption of a plurilateral agreement, which we have not discussed at all, on investment facilitation, which is basically ease of doing business. Now, what had happened was this is an agreement which about 126 countries out of 160 countries odd have agreed upon, a plurilateral agreement. Now, when we are talking about FTAs, don't forget that even plurilaterals are non-multilateral. And why plurilaterals took place was, I'll come back to that later, but we objected. We objected to that at Abu Dhabi in MC13. And can you imagine that a number of developing countries and least developed countries who found it very awful, and they confided in me personally that, look, we found it very awful. Now, this impacts on our aspirations to become a leader of Global South. Now, nobody in the Commerce Ministry understands these, they cannot connect these dots.
So then the takeaway, and this is a public
I'm just
session.
giving an example.
No, what I'm saying is this is a public session, but you are basically saying that we're not at the cutting edge of where we need to be.
I mean, in the sense that the Commerce Ministry did not know, this kind of situation, that what you are doing is something which is, you're cutting your nose to spite your face.
Raja, you write both on as it were,
So therefore, I mean, let me conclude that on economic diplomacy, I think, the problem is, and I would like Ujjwal Bhatia to speak about it. He's been one of our very sober ambassadors to the WTO as against many others that I have seen. I'm not going to name them. Don't laugh. No, anyway, the point is that, we are well known for being negative unnecessarily, and that reflects, Suman, on the point that we're not interested in being open.
No, so the issue that this raises, coming back to Montague and coming back to Martin, is the issue the bureaucracy, or is the issue the leadership or is it, as Montague was arguing, is it the protectionism of our private sector? So what gets in the way? No, I don't want you to answer. I'm just framing the issue, if you don't mind. Ambassador Bhatia, where are you? Yeah, please. Okay.
Mike, please.
Right. I mean, both should India write off the WTO as a forum? What should should it be more proactive? And what have we gained, if Pradeep is right, in being always cited as a naysayer?
Well, I'd like to respond to what Martin said about India's place in the emerging order. And I think we should not really be focused on whether we'll be an advanced country or a higher middle income country. The point he made was that we will be a very important country on the world stage. And I think our economic diplomacy has to reflect that aspiration. And how do we do that? And I think in some of the points which Pradeep mentioned, we are a great supporter of multilateralism. But today the world, the WTO is in such a place where there is not much consensus being developed on multilateral issues. And therefore the question is, should we be opposing plurilateral initiatives when multilateral issues are not on the table as of now? So, and the other point he mentioned, again, I would agree with that. If we have this aspiration of being the leader of the global south, then we need to voice issues of the global south in such a way as to build consensus in the WTO, rather than just saying no. So I think there is some scope for us to reflect on what our economic diplomacy should be in the context of our aspirations for the future.
Thank you so much. Raja, may I now turn to you? Raja Mohan, please introduce us.
As you know, I'm an interloper into this, but since you invited me, I mean, basically three things. Saying, without internal modernization, your ability to deal with a changing world, especially when the rules are being redrawn, will get harder and harder. So therefore, without internal modernization, we're not going to do much of an economic diplomacy. Second, when our negotiators go abroad and say, give me more time, I need time and space, all kinds of other excuses that were made. You win time and space, the diplomats win that time and space, but that time is not used for changing the way you things. The third thing I would say is, you are in a place, much of the trade rules, the economic rules are being rewritten. The WTO, Trump comes back, is even going to be even more dead than it is today. It doesn't work for the United States, therefore they're going to change the rules. Here I think we got to get used to plurilateral arrangements. We got to create like-minded coalitions. That means breaking away from the traditional premises of multilateralism and working only in multilateral solutions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sanjeev, do you have a thought? You've talked a lot of. Do you have a thought on how to create state capacity in this specific area? Have you thought about that at all, or is that? I mean, that's what I understood Raja to be talking about.
I mean, it's a long topic, but let me say, I think it is true that we need to begin thinking of issues in a completely new and fresh way, where Indian negotiators go to an issue in a fresh way, looking at how things actually are. And I'll give you one example to illustrate the problem. For example, one of the things we always negotiate for in the rest of the world is for work visas in other countries. Now, in my view at least, it's a complete waste of time. And I'll tell you why. You know, what are these work visas justified on? Oh, we need H-1B visas because our IT companies need to go there. Hello, you want to work from home. This is the one industry that should be able to work from home. Why do you need to move to America to do this? You should be able to do it from wherever you are. Need a B1 visa to go there occasionally at best. So point is, this is a 1990s idea of what IT industry needs. Mm-hmm. And yet, this is one of the important things that our negotiators negotiate for. So I'm just giving an example of outdated things we have in our list.
Can I reframe the question? And
Yeah.
maybe, so is this because of lack of awareness, or is this reflecting, as it were, the influence of lobbies, or what?
No, I think slow movement of how things are. And I think here there is an issue of institutional memory in our system. So what happens is that, you see, a learning system would learn after a while that it is pointless negotiating for H-1B visas. But what happens, just by the time the negotiators learned this, he is transferred to becoming Joint Secretary Fisheries, and somebody else comes here. And that person has been reading in the newspapers that H-1B visas is a wonderful thing to have. So again starts negotiating this. I'm exaggerating, but this is basically how it works. Okay. And I think this is something in which, for example, in this specific area, we have been trying to create, for example, IIFT as a repository of institutional knowledge. I don't know if it's working, but certainly there is a realization that this is an issue and we are trying to fix it.
And also, I think that we are not organized for the way the world is run today. So if you think about electric vehicles, the batteries are done by the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers. The cars are done by the Ministry of Heavy Industries. Electronics are done by the Ministry of Electronics. By the time we are already 15 years behind China, their fiscal powers and the fiscal interventions are 10x what we can afford. And all these ministries will keep pushing files to each other. And so we are just not organized efficiently. You think about energy prices, energy costs, and you have a Ministry of Power, a Ministry of Coal, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Ministry of Oil and Gas. Why? There should be one Ministry of Energy. So I think the government's organization itself is, I think, grossly inefficient, and I think it needs to be restructured quite dramatically if we need to compete efficiently and respond to what Raja was saying, that whatever time is bought for us to move faster, we need to have the government move more efficient.
So, Martin, if I could just come to you. I mean, I'm, in a sense, trying to oblige Montague. There are other things we could be talking about, to get a sense about what the forces are pro and anti-openness. But since we've got onto state capacity, let me just ask, are you impressed by the ability of the British state to modernize? And this is a serious question. And where does the push come from? Does the push come from the cabinet secretary? Does it come from politicians? Any reflections from an advanced economy?
Well, I'm glad there's a simple question. So the answer to that is no. Now, the more interesting question is whether there are any that are good at it. Now, I'm not an expert on state capacity, but I would guess among the developed world, it will be a few of the small countries, Finland, Sweden, obviously Singapore, and those are going to be the models. Mm-hmm. There's a crucial aspect to that, which I think is very important, and it's something you have to think about, which is the advantage of being very small, and particularly being very small and open. So we wouldn't have a debate in Singapore whether trade was important. That debate wouldn't last more than a second. So the question they would, so I have a part of my recent book which discuss, well, why is Singapore able to do what it does? And the major answer to that, of course, there's a prior conditions, is it's a matter of life and death. And so you design your administrative system to do what is most important, which is sustain yourself as a credible platform for global commerce. And if you're a very large country, or even a moderately large country, that's a second or third order consideration. And there are all the other considerations, and they dominate the way administration works. So it is very, very difficult for a very, very large country to focus itself in a way that makes this work efficiently and quickly. China is something of an exception, but I don't have time to go into the way that works in my perception.
Okay, so this was not central to what Martin had to say, but Sanjeev has put on the table the notion that efficient capital allocation is a very important element in certainly in productivity and possibly in competitiveness as well.
25 years.
Uh-huh. Okay, fine. So Neelkanth, I would just like you, as somebody who is in the financial sector, what works well in Indian capital allocation and what doesn't work so well? And have we actually, and there are many people from the finance ministry here, have we actually, did the IBC and all that represent a cusp change in the allocation, at least of credit?
Oh, absolutely. So that's a simple answer. I think post IBC, we are seeing companies treat debt very differently than they would earlier. So when you see marquee old houses losing control of their assets because they defaulted on debt, I think the seriousness with which you take debt has increased significantly. It is going in the other direction right now, meaning companies are actually deleveraging. But that's primarily because I think the operating cash flows are growing way faster than the need to invest. So what we've seen is operating cash flows for the top 200 companies have gone from about 4.3 trillion rupees, 4.3 lakh crores in FY19 to about 12 lakh crores, 12 trillion rupees in FY24. And we estimate, these are forecasts, when we are stock analysts, we get wrong often, but this can rise significantly in the next 5 years. It is only in, I think, FY27 onwards that we see debt going up. But I think what we have managed to do is create efficient plumbing channels. So cost of equity capital is coming down. What we should expect, because partly what Sanjeev said, that our fertility rate is falling, infant, as other low age dependency ratios are coming off, savings should be going up, and they are going up. The aggregate number does not seem that hot because physical savings are going up because people are buying houses, but savings are going up. And what we need to do better is allocate. Like today, if you do the equity risk premium, I mean, for the non-financial types, basically if you save in a riskier asset class, which is equities, stock markets, you should be expecting a higher rate of return. Now, that is called the equity risk premium. The equity risk premium in India compared to, I mean, when you measure it against the risk-free rate, which is the government bond yield, is actually negative. So today, Indian equities are way more expensive than Indian sovereign bonds. Now, the reason why that happens is because the plumbing channels are totally distorted. So there are these SIPs and EPFO, and which is good. I mean, a lot of these funds are now coming into the equity markets, incessant flow of capital, which has reduced the volatility in stock markets. By reducing volatility in stock markets, the asset class has become even more attractive, and so more money is coming in. When I started talking about these unintended flows of capital, it was $25 billion a year. Now, annually, we are getting $45 billion a year. And so equity capital is very cheap. Now, but that's resulting in Hyundai doing an IPO, taking $3.5 billion out. Whirlpool selling stake here and repaying their debt globally. It is not really going into productive assets yet. And I think what we need to do is find ways of channeling some of these savings into the bond market, get cost of capital down substantially, what the government is doing, and I think our bond markets are very inefficient. And despite the substantial reduction in fiscal deficits, we have not been able to see a commensurate reduction in bond yields. And I think we need to be very focused on improving the health of the bond market. We've been talking about it for 20 years, but that doesn't mean it's not a big problem.
Okay, yeah. Ambassador Mukherjee?
Thank you very much. I wanted to make first one comment to Dr. Martin Wolf, that in his presentation, I was intrigued to see that there was no reference on the impact of unilateral sanctions imposed by the West in the context of Russia-Ukraine on the global economy. That is something that I would love to have some response. As far as FTAs are concerned, I wanted to say that one of the problems that India used to face on FTAs with the EU was because the EU brought in BTIA, that is investment plus free trade, which it was much easier to just negotiate a free trade agreement rather than bring in investment, which they did. The other issue was that when you have negotiations, it doesn't matter whether the person is transferred to fisheries or not. That is for Mr. Sanyal. The point is that when you are negotiating between basically two unequal partners, one partner who is a developed economy and another that was just about emerging, then you are asked to make very deep concessions while the partner concerned is not necessarily non-protectionist. And that is one of the difficulties that we had, for instance, with the India-EU BTIA, because it was the United Kingdom before Brexit that put up the most protectionist conditions, because they had a service economy with strengths similar to the Indian economy, which is precisely why it is now very ironical in case we have an FTA with United Kingdom under a new Labour government rather than the long-awaited FTA with the European Union. These were just comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, Pradeep? Martin? Yeah. Did you want to respond? I was going to give you time at the end.
Okay, this is a very simple one. Obviously, 30-minute discussion of the entire global economy and its current status, it leaves out quite a lot. I can give you a very long list. But this was subsumed in my comments about the various threats to stability, among which were included war. I can't remember whether I actually mentioned the word Ukraine, but that's obviously within. Sorry, that fell within that category. International relations more broadly. It's one of the risks in the current, and it's not. Sorry, and it remains a risk. When I presented this at the NCAR, a variant of this, not quite as good. I argued that if India were successful in continuing to grow like this for another 15 years, say, it is not a zero possibility, probably substantially greater than zero, that the attitude of the United States toward it would start looking a bit like the attitude of the United States towards China.
Right. Okay, well, you've provided us a platform. Sanjeev has reminded us that the core issue facing India, which you helped put in a global context, is can we sustain and accelerate growth for 25 years? And that includes issues of productivity, issues of competitiveness, not just those of trade. So my reading of India's journey over the last 30 years is actually we've done not badly on productivity, but nonetheless, we've not done well on structural change, particularly as represented by the share of both, well, certainly population, to some extent value added in agriculture, and the share of manufacturing. So Nilkant, how worried do you get about that? What should we worry about? Because the way I see it, we have the challenge of trying to remain globally competitive while having to endure or to accommodate the green transition. Um, or, um, so the question I guess I have is, um, where do you see us as competitive, and are we trying to be competitive in areas where we don't have much hope?
No, see, I think the problem, or at least the opportunity size in the context of the global economy itself, is a lot smaller than we think. See, labor-intensive manufacturing is perhaps very productive and very useful for economies which are much smaller. And if you have an economy the size of China starting to do that, then you see the impact and retaliation and protectionism and all of that coming up. Inequality, in fact, global inequality or the rise in inequality globally is something that also is a concern. So from the Indian perspective, I think the reason why I'm still optimistic is, and why productivity growth has been so strong, is also that on the services side, I think we continue to get best practices from the world. And I think in the next 20 years, business services exports will do to productivity growth and dollar flows and job creation and urbanization what IT services did in the last 30 years. And so we hold great strengths there. A lot of it is demographics, but it's also about how we've dealt with the education system, how we've expanded capacity. On the manufacturing side, unfortunately, I don't see that being very conducive to labor-intensive growth, given what's happening to robotics, what's happening with how factories are managed. I think the use of AI, even on services side, I think AI is an opportunity, but on the manufacturing side, actually may be a threat. So I think that as we plan the next 20 years, we have to stop looking at the solutions used by the Asian tigers and for China, because that opportunity itself is not perhaps as big as it used to be.
Okay, so we can go to the audience, particularly. I was interested. Gocharan, yes, yeah. And then what?
I think the diagnosis that Martin Wolf has provided is.
Can you please identify yourself?
Yeah, my mic is defective.
It's fine, it's fine.
Okay, this is a little better. So the diagnosis that we have been provided by Martin Wolf is fundamentally correct, but we haven't really addressed, and Nilkant was addressing it towards the end. But really, we need to go a few minutes. We need to spend a few more minutes on it, which is it's really the elephant in the room. Can we create an industrial revolution? And our failure, we have done 6% growth, and that's terrific over 30 years for a democracy. But we have not created the jobs that we needed to create. And we know that 45% of our population is engaged in agriculture and is rural. And yes, services will do well and so on. But really, we can't become a developed or aspire to get anywhere near a developed country status unless we can solve this particular problem. And from what I've studied in it, and this is where I'm going to ask a question now. The work that I have seen on the developments on robotics, etc., green industry, etc., suggests to me that we have another dozen years at least before the first people to get affected will be the white-collar jobs and not the blue-collar jobs. And so our failure as a manufacturing country with less than 2% of the global market share that our manufacturers have is a true failure. And how we can turn this around, I think it's the central question for us as a country, because we have to give a chance to the majority of our people. They have to have that sense of ease that comes with being a middle class country. So that's my question to the panel. How do we create an industrial revolution?
Okay, Kirit, yes?
Thank you. I'm Kirit Parikh. One of the things that I missed in the discussion today is that, a technological change, artificial intelligence and GPT, and also the similar kind of change that is taking place in biotechnology. I think these are going to change dramatically the future growth of the economy. And I think here India is lagging way behind China. China is a world leader in some of this technology development, and we need to do something seriously in our higher education system as well as the very low level primary education system to create the right kind of manpower and be able to produce the same kind of technological change, development and progress that China has made.
Okay, so let me just reframe that question. Maybe we can take one more. But so I think Gurcharan's question was, why does it matter that we have only 2% of global global trade in manufacturers? And the second question really is, should India wish to be at the cutting edge of research? I know that when Jensen Huang was here, he said, look, I mean, it's an expensive game to get into. We're placing some bets in the chips business. So quick reactions to these before we take other questions as well. Yeah.
So I think there are obviously specific things about AI and so on, but I think at a very macro level, you mentioned structural reforms. So it's not that we haven't done structural reforms. We have said, but we have done a particular kind of structural reform for the last 25 years, which is essentially to withdraw the Indian state from things it should not do. In fact, that's why we tend to use the word liberalization and reform in pretty much the same breath. But I think we are now coming to this list. Some more of this needs to be done, ease of doing business and so on. But I think we have now come to the point where we need to switch into the zone where we get the Indian state to do the things it actually should do. And in that, first thing that we need to do is build infrastructure. And I think finally we are building world-class, serious scale infrastructure, which is why places like Mumbai today feel like, construction zones. But there are two things that we really need to get our act together. And I think the next 25 years of reform has got to do with getting these to work. First of all, reforming administration. And the other is reforming judiciary. Enforcement of contract and general administration. Both of these are an important part of what the Indian state should do, but is simply not delivering the goods effectively. So while we can have specific things about specific sectors, I think getting our infrastructure right, which I think we are beginning to do, and getting our administrative system reformed finally and seriously, move it from a mentality of control towards service delivery, which I think needs to be done. And of course, getting our judicial system to work in a reasonable speed. These three things, I think, are the critical to getting the big framework, the structural framework that will be needed for generating that next round of growth.
Okay. Martin, do you have a view on the role and importance of technology and technology transfer over this period? And specifically, does it matter that India is not at the frontier, whereas the argument of Kirit was that it's something to be worried about?
Well, I have views on pretty well everything that's been said, but we need to be precise. It is very clear that countries that have succeeded in sustaining development over long periods upgrade and transform their economies multiple times on the way, and a lot of that is a mixture of learning and, of course, acquiring in various ways the know-how of countries that have it, and then learning how to use it, spreading it through the economy and leapfrogging further. And if you do this very well, you shift over time from being predominantly an acquirer of know-how that is applied into being a generator of it. And China is a wonderful example. And I remember 20 years ago, I can't go there, but I've been to China every year for 30 years. One used to have a discussion in China about, well, are they ever going to be world leaders? And even 10 years ago, that was a quite widely shared view, and nobody really discusses this now. So I think given where India is now, I would be concerned, and I don't have time to go into this, that India's manufacturing sector has been relative to other rapidly emerging large economies so undynamic. But I wouldn't be wildly concerned, given where we are now, that it is predominantly, or if it is, an importer of ideas rather than the frontier. But it is worth considering, I think, quite carefully what sort of institutions will be needed in the state and in companies to transform over time from being efficient acquirers and users of existing knowledge to being at the frontier, because that will be part of this, very clearly part of this journey. Now, in the Chinese case, finally, the acquisition process was a fascinating combination of force, fraud, and brilliance. And how far India can manage that is a very interesting question, but you clearly have to offer really juicy carrots. And what China offered was the carrot of the fastest growing market in the world. And in return for that carrot, a huge slew of major companies transferred a very significant part of their know-how. And that is a policy that I don't know whether this is being thought about, but it certainly is one that I will be thinking about if I were in India.
And I wholeheartedly endorse that view because, in 2004, 60%, so to answer Gurcharan's question, 60% of China's exports in 2004 came from multinationals operating in China. So if you want to accelerate the process, if you want to grow at 1.5%, 2% for 200 years, you can wait for things to happen in natural flow. But if you want to accelerate that process, then you need to make compromises. The Koreans taught mobile phone design to the Chinese, and the Chinese took away that business. The Samsung and LG gave second-hand TFT LCD fabs to the Chinese, and 10 years later, the Korean businesses were shut down. So I'm not saying we should do the same to our partners, but that's part of that process, that you need to partner and accelerate the process. And I think we have struggled. I think think about the pace at which we sign advanced pricing agreements, give tax clarity, judicial uncertainty. I think we are really, really bad at that. And that, I think, slows down the process of bringing. But one quick point on labor-intensive manufacturing. And, you go through the global mix of trade, 25% of it is electronics and machinery. A very little part of that is labor-intensive. And whatever it is already moving to India. So we're already doing 30% of global smartphone assembly. And it's very important for that to happen for the upstream value systems. And we are going to invest in that. I think new schemes are being envisaged. I read it in the papers. On apparel, apparel already China has gone down to 140, 150 billion a year. I think maybe there's another $100 billion of trade that can move out of China. Toys are very small. So when you actually go through the list of categories on trade, other than possibly processed food, maybe, you know, $30-40 billion extra of apparel. The only opportunity is in electronics and, the things that are growing very rapidly, because that is not large enough to create the number of jobs in the middle class that you talk about. It's absolutely essential, but I'm not sure we can rely on it to solve the problem.
Could I just, because then we'll have to go to we're past hard stop. So an insight or a data point, which I think is right, but that I've got from Arvind Virmani, is that actually in terms of the value of manufacturers, India is the fourth largest producer in the world. I mean, third, yeah. So the issue is not, Pache, what Gulchadan was asking about an industrial revolution. In terms of production, it's we don't export it. And the question is, does that matter? Or is it production that matters?
No, it's production that matters. And in fact, so the way to read the inputs that China got, that it wasn't just the dollars they earned from that. It was the expertise that came in and that made them accelerate that transition. And in fact, that's the point I'm making. In fact, when I was talking about that, in the $16 trillion of additional GDP, at most $1 trillion will come from the change in net trade. It was that it is through the financialization channel and through the productivity channel that trade openness affects GDP. And so if we can attract that productivity booster, I mean, the moment you start doing high quality stuff for exports, guess what you do? I mean, there's a much larger market right next to you. I mean, you shouldn't do what the pharma companies have done, run 2 different factories, one for the US, one for India. But in most of the markets, you will see that automatically starts transitioning. So openness and accelerating in the next 5-7 years, we should try to get as much of foreign investment in, not just for exporting or reducing the imports, but to just improve the quality of our manufacturing.
Good, yes. Okay, so closing comments. Martin, do you want to start or end? It's up to you.
Well, we're going to closing comments. I'm going to take the last.
Okay, fine. Pradeep.
Right. I thought it was a very interesting discussion, and we've discovered a lot of new things, frankly. We are more in tune with Sanjeev's views that has come across as more lay and a little more understanding, being more tuned to political economy rather than economy. And that has been our forte for the last 40 years, as someone has said. I think the point which you made is very important. One point which you have not looked at, which is now becoming an endemic issue in the country, corruption. When you talk about ease of doing business, most of the problems in ease of doing business is because of corruption, coupled with lack of accountability. There's no accountability at all. People say, okay, let him go, transfer him, whatever. People who have been convicted have been brought back also. So how do you improve? And we've therefore written a paper called Ease of Running a Business. So forget doing a business. Usually ease of doing a business is considered to be, ease of entering a business, ease of approvals and permits, etc., etc. But Sanjeev, what is happening is what we see on the ground today is corruption is increasing hugely. At every level, a patwari who could do a land deed transfer from agricultural land to industrial land would charge 5,000 rupees to do it. Doesn't take anything less than 50,000 rupees now.
And you're saying that this has not been digitized?
So, no. The problem is this become institutionalized now. Now even corruption, I get a joke on WhatsApp saying that even EMI is being done for paying off your bribes. You can do it on a monthly installment.
I'm not sure that that's data-based.
No, I mean, one is that anybody, you could go and talk to a street vendor. No street vendor survives without paying a hafta to the police. In spite of all the judgments
But
and orders.
the point for sustaining growth for 25 years, it ain't going to happen. Is that it?
No, it is going to happen, but what
because we've sustained 6%.
No, but what Sanjeev has said is important for us to take a leap. If we have to take a leap, then we have to improve our accountability, we have to improve our administrative system.
How long did it take the UK to get rid of rotten boroughs? 100 years, maybe?
No, rotten boroughs is very quick.
I see. Okay. Anyway, No, but I mean, they've been going on since the
No, and
late
then,
80s.
one thing which he rightly said is something which we've seen on our hand, that,
I-
you have a joint secretary dealing with trade policy who comes and asks me, he says, what is a non-paper, Pradeep? It was very sweet of him to ask me rather than to ask one of his colleagues. Then I had to explain to him what a non-paper is. The non-paper, by name itself, sounds like an oxymoron. How can you have a non-paper? Then I could explain to him and understood. And then he goes away to fisheries. Well, he fortunately retires at the highest position a civil servant can reach, but that is not the issue.
Let's move
What
on.
I'm saying is that you're right. We have no specialization. This used to exist even in the ICS times. The Indian Civil Service time, the British ensured
Okay.
that there were, 3 or
Yeah,
4
but
categories.
the punchline is we're not going to get there unless we fix this.
Unless we fix all this.
Okay.
So let me say that what you are talking about is really this daily friction of corruption and rent seeking, which happens, a Patwari problem or the Hafta problem. And you're right. And I don't think it's getting worse, but certainly it has existed from the beginning and it is not helping, certainly. And we need to fix it. And I've actually made a major effort on my own side to do something called process reforms. So those of you who follow my own writings will know this. I have been working, and I've written extensively on it as well, literally going process by process, department by department, looking at how, how does the process of patenting in India work? How does the process of voluntarily shutting down a company, shut down, does this department even need to exist? And one by one, I've been doing this for now 7 years. And I'm surprised by literally dozens of these that have got done. And let me give an example of what happens when you just open up the gates and smoothen something up a little bit. So, shutting down a company voluntarily in India, I'm not talking about insolvency and bankruptcy, just shutting down a company voluntarily, which is 90% of companies shut down are usually voluntarily shut down because the person doesn't want to do it anymore or whatever. It used to take 4 to 5 years to shut down a company, even when nobody was disputing the fact. So there's nobody, it's not like some creditors coming in, etc. Everybody agrees this company needs to be shut down. And yet it takes 4 years. And it's a real hassle because you have to continue to do the accounts, you have to hold board meetings as long as it exists, and so on. So we went in there, dug in there a couple of years ago, and discovered that it requires a bunch of no objection certificates from different people. And for some strange reason, this had to happen in sequence. Now, there's no reason why it can't just happen simultaneously. More importantly, and this is where your rent seeking happened, it required an advertisement to be put up for that this company has to shut down. And so when we researched this, we found that this is where the problem arises. Because you have to advertise this name in some newspaper, and usually it's in an obscure newspaper, the name comes out and this company will be shut out. Does anyone have an objection? And it would take years for the name to come up. And I'll let you imagine why that was the case. Now, about a year ago, we introduced an automated system by which the company that wants to shut it down puts its stuff up. And now what happens, it sends an email or a message to 3, 4, whoever was required, the tax people, labor, etc., who had to give no objection. And that happens simultaneously. And then after a couple of weeks, if they do not raise an objection, the system itself recognizes that nobody has objected to it and sends the message off to the department that's supposed to send the advertisement out. And there is no discretion. It has to, at that stage, advertise. In my view, even that stage can be gotten rid of because we can just put the name up on the website. Anyway, this system, new system, automated system is called CSpace. It has now functioned for about a year. And we have discovered that what used to take 4 years now takes 90 days. India is now the fastest place to shut down a company voluntarily.
Okay, so change is possible.
Absolutely.
Nilkant, your concluding thoughts.
Yes. So I think I would echo what Martin said. When I look at China, I think if you were to grow fast, if you want to grow at 8%, 9% a year for 30, 40 years, every 5, 6 years, you need to take gut-wrenching reforms, things that will pose existential risks to the current power structures. And you need to be comfortable with that. If you're driving at 20 kilometers an hour, test whether handles this and that, doesn't make a difference. But if you're driving at 80 kilometers an hour, you need to be extremely careful and get used to turbulence, get used to uncertainty, get used to distress. And if you just read the annual history of what China has gone through, I think we need to increase our ambition and increase our appetite for change and uncertainty and discomfort. And the areas in which I think we need to change, I would re-emphasize, have to be around how to get our urban infrastructure right, how do we get our fiscal structures right. There's just too much money going at a subnational level. Our states are too large. We are not governing our districts properly. And so we need to look at the structuring of the governments. There are many, many aggressive changes we need to make if we need to accelerate the pace of growth in the pace of a slowing world.
So I think, Martin, you have the final word.
Okay. I think that nearly all the comments that have been made are not problematic from my point of view, and there's a lot of agreement. Let me just make the following comments where I think are interesting. First, I agree with Neil Kant fundamentally on what is the benefit of trade. It's not direct, it's indirect. But one part of it, of openness more broadly, which is very important for the Chinese, and they understood this, is by forcing firms to operate in global markets, you force them to operate to global standards and internalizing them. And the Chinese understood that, and the Chinese firms understood this because they were competing side by side with Western companies. And that, to make that possible, that means you have to operate your administrative systems to global standards, and that includes infrastructure. But that's what makes business come, and that forces business and to attract competitors here to operate at global standards. They need that, and that will force all the Indian firms ultimately to do it. And it will be quite wrenching, but I think it would add a lot to dynamism. The second point I wanted to make is I'm more optimistic than Neil Kant on growth and inequality. Not because there isn't a link, though that's very controversial, because my general feeling is, and this is an important point, even if it's true, if you grow at 10% a year or even at 7 or 8% a year, you can pretty easily, unless you screw up badly, run a system in which everybody's getting better off. And the really important thing about the Chinese economy, at various times that change over time, everybody has pretty well. Now, of course, they don't have elections, and I'm not denying there are greater difficulties in that, but it is potentially positive sum. And the point at which it gets difficult is when growth really slows. But that should not be an immediate concern for India if it's well run. And the final point, Sanjeev said lots of very interesting things, some of which I disagree with. But there's one point that he made which I think is very interesting. I am not persuaded we're moving into a saving world. And I've thought about this a lot. But assume we are. That has a very interesting implication, his story, which he didn't pursue. That means he thinks that India should be able to and should run, I think he said was implying, a very large current account deficit for a long time, financed from abroad. I'm not sure that many of my friends will be happy with that. But if you thought that, then the efficiency of capital market issue becomes absolutely central. And it's probably the biggest advantage of being open in that way is that it would force further efficiency. But the regulatory problems associated with running very large current account deficits and therefore accumulating net liabilities of various kinds are very, very significant. Whether India should embrace that as an option, if I understood him correctly, is I think something that might well be worth debating at another session of this panel.
Okay, well, Martin, thank you for triggering what was, I think, a rich discussion. And to the audience, those who've stayed, thank you for staying this long. It must have sounded a little bit geeky. Now, I've got to take off my hat as moderator of a session for cuts and put back the hat of Vice Chairman Niti Aayog. And so the question of what all of this means for particularly our interaction with states, and in particularly the governance of cities. I think that's a very important kind of takeaway. I mean, there's very little I disagreed with in what Martin had to say, but I think I accept and have been thinking about this issue about what is, in an uncertain world, a speed limit or a safety limit for the current account deficit. But I think that the insight that was very important was that if you're growing at twice the rate of the of growth of the world economy, even if your trade ratio is staying the same, you are going to be a larger and larger part of global trade. And how you manage that becomes an important exercise in economic diplomacy, which is why I raised that as the first set of questions. Martin, we're in your debt. Pradeep, I was honored, and over to you as the organizer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suman. I will not take more time. I thought, as you rightly said, it was a very interesting and rich discussion. We have also recorded it, and so it will be available on YouTube if you would like to go through it again, which I would certainly encourage you to do. Having said that, I'm very grateful for all of you to have come here and to have conveyed your good wishes to us for this benefit. We are wedded to the fact that we would like to become a developed country as sooner than 2047. For me, it's as you rightly said, Martin, it's not impossible, but it's difficult. I agree. But then, unless, as we say, that unless you aim for the heaven, you can't reach the sky. So we have to be aspirational. And unless we are aspirational, we can't even get out of morass as we are. We continue to work very deeply at the grassroots level, and we see poverty firsthand, and not through these hallowed portals of seminars. And we see as to how people behave, etc. And as I've said, honestly, Sanjeev, corruption has now become an endemic issue. It affects every human being today in our country, and unless that is done seriously, addressed seriously, we will continue to be facing a lot of problems as we see. Unemployment, again, is a major problem as we see today. This is something which we need to address. Neelkant, you spoke about the labor-intensive sector. I don't know how you're going to promote the labor-intensive sector, because that is the only way how we can create more jobs. And of course, it's the global markets, which, and not necessarily that in the labor-intensive area, we don't see much scope for global supply chains. I mean, if you have to make a leather shoe, there are no supply chain, really speaking, except that you might buy eyelets somewhere, you might buy lace somewhere, but that's about all. It's only the most sophisticated equipment which requires global supply chains, where we are quite well equipped, and there are many things which are already happening in India. And it is growing. And I think the last point which you made rightly was how do we get more foreign investment, including foreign companies coming into India in order to, they bring in technology, they bring in not only money, but they bring in a lot of, and of course they have a peer effect. And the peer effect is what actually helps them to grow. And the Chinese example is good. This is something which I'm sure the government is seized of. And both of you advise the Prime Minister, I'm sure you will continue to advise the Prime Minister to take these steps forward in a constructive way. Now, one point which came up very obliquely was institutional reforms. I'm not talking about administrative reforms, but what is happening, unfortunately, is that our institutions are being eroded. As we see, across the, look at the example of one thing which we and the NGO sector suffers a lot, is the amendments in the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. What you've done is you've thrown out a lot of people out of jobs. You can see the impact of it, because you cannot do any sub-granting. And there were a lot of small NGOs, 5, 10, and so on, who were running, excellent work in small villages. They have been affected very badly. So this is something which you'll have to think about seriously. It has had a direct impact on jobs. We've had this very funny amendment for silly reasons that sub-granting is not allowed, with the result that, anyway, we have found a way around it, but that is not the point. The point is that smaller NGOs are very badly affected, and it's directly impacting jobs at the rural areas. But having said that, I just took this as an example that institutionally we have to ensure that things are back in a fashion that it helps to generate wealth, as the Prime Minister has often said. And this is what even Keir Starmer has spoken about, that, you know, the new Labour is going to talk about wealth creation and not and read Financial Times. Thank you very much. With that, let me thank you all very much.